Marina Alexis. She should be a writer.
Although we may not have realized it at the time, Pretty Little Liars was problematic in many ways. From its portrayal of eating disorders and mental illness to its tendency to kill off an alarming number of its LGBT and characters of color, fans have started to really delve into the issues that PLL did not address well. But more than anything, I would argue that Pretty Little Liars had a major problem with predators and the romanticization of both predatory behavior and sexual assault. All of the Liars had more than their fair share of love interests throughout PLL's run. But what's disturbing about the immense amount of romantic subplots on the show is just how many of them featured grown adults, primarily men, pursuing relationships with high school-aged girls, and how this was almost never portrayed as problematic and predatory. Before I get into what was without a doubt the most glorified relationship between a predator and victim, I have to address the sheer volume of so-called romances between grown adults and teenage girls. First, we have Allison, who, at 15 years old, had been involved with 3 grown men. I've often seen fans claim that Allie was overly promiscuous or otherwise at fault for her relationships with Ian, Ezra, and Wilden, when in reality they were grown men who were preying on a freshman in high school. We know that Wilden went as far as having sex with her, as Marlene King confirmed, on Twitter as opposed to in her actual show, that he was the one her pregnancy scare was about. And although the season 4 finale tried to claim that Ian never crossed any PG-rated lines,
we never had Allison.
The camera set up in front of their unmade hotel bed implies otherwise. Ezra's case is a little more complicated, since Allison allegedly claimed to be 21 during their relationship. Even that, however, is called into question by the shot of a letter from her that the Liars find in his lair, in which she refers to her age as 17. It is so important to understand that regardless of Allison's otherwise terrible actions, or how aggressively she appeared to pursue any of these men, she was a child, and without a doubt a victim of their predatory actions. Ian in particular clearly knows that what he's doing is wrong and illegal. And while the show's narrative paints both Ian and Wilden as creeps, Ian cheating on Melissa is seen as more of an issue than Allison's age, and Wilden preying on a girl possibly half his age was completely glossed over altogether. And as the seasons of PLL continue, we're introduced to a whole medley of inappropriate relationships. Holbrook kissing both Hannah and Allison, Wren cheating on Melissa with 16-year-old Spencer and continuing to remain a recurring love interest, the ambiguous ages of characters like Jake and Lorenzo, and brief flings with undoubtedly grown men like Colin and Dean, are just some of the romances between adult men and high school girls that were completely normalized on the show. In fact, not only were these predatory behaviors never called out for what they were, but most of these men were meant to be viewed in an overall positive light. The show was often blatantly hypocritical when it came to how it portrayed these men. Zach was rightfully seen as an inappropriate creep for hitting on Hannah, while we were supposed to root for and sympathize with men like Wren and Jason for the exact same thing. How were younger viewers expected to identify predatory behavior in men that PLL deemed bad, when very similar actions were completely brushed over in other situations? It made the show's definition of inappropriate interactions totally inconsistent. And PLL often took things a step further by going so far as implying that the girls themselves were the ones in the wrong. When Spencer's family finds out about her and Wren, they completely ice her out. And the fact that both of Melissa's old boyfriends prey on her is held over her head right through to the very last season.
Because I know how you like to shop out of other people's carts.
The show does everything but directly call Spencer a slut, and this mentality bled right down to the fanbase. Spencer hasn't stopped being criticized for stealing her sister's boyfriend and fiancé, when the truth is that they were the ones who initiated contact with her, and they were both grown men who took advantage of Spencer's insecurities and feelings of inferiority within her family. Even Troyan has spoken out in interviews about the tendency to vilify Spencer for her role in these interactions, while letting the actual predators off scot-free.
Everybody blames Spencer.
That's what I'm doing.
And you know what I want to turn around and say is she's a 16-year-old girl, and all of the boys that she's stolen, they always kiss her first, and they're all over 18.
For most of the men who pursued the Liars and other teenagers, it was clear that the audience was meant to see no issue with their actions. Jason's brief pre-time jump relationship with Arya is a good example of this.
Your pink hair.
Really?
I thought it was cool.
I can't count the amount of times I've seen fans express that she should have ended up with him over Ezra. And while I definitely agree that Ezra was the last person Arya should have ended up with, I've never understood why Jason is viewed as the ideal option. Not only was he another grown man who showed a clear attraction to a 16-year-old girl, but we know that he was one of the founders of the NAT Club, a group centered around taking pictures and videos of underage girls. There's some debate over at what point Jason left the club, but there's never been any indication that it started out as anything other than what boils down to an unbelievably creepy hobby at best, and, depending on the content of the videos, potential child pornography at worst. There's also the fact that Jason was in possession of a series of mega creepy photos of Aria asleep. He claims that it was actually Allie who took them, but we see no confirmation of this, and it seems like little more than a weak excuse. I get it. Jason's hot. And I found their interactions in Season 7 fun to watch, except that it was already established that he had pursued her when she was a 16-year-old girl. Even grown women weren't excluded from PLL's predatory tendencies. We can't forget about Talia, the woman who appeared to be attempting to compete with Emily for Ezra's attention, only to hook up with Emily herself. And even worse, we later find out that Talia has a husband, and has only been getting physically intimate with Emily as a way of experimenting with her sexuality. There's a progressive quality to the show's portrayal of a grown, married woman exploring her sexual preferences, freely and with her spouse's blessing. But even though Emily was canonically 18 at the time, this is still a woman in at least her 20s, choosing to experiment with a senior in high school. If you had the desire to explore your sexuality, why would you choose a girl who's the definition of barely legal? The last inappropriate relationship between an adult and teenager that I want to focus on in this section is Garrett and Jenna. This is one of the dynamics that was completely normalized. Not only was the age difference never brought up, but neither was the fact that, as a police officer, Garrett was in a pretty massive position of power over Jenna. It's made out as though they're on completely equal footing due to their matching devious attitudes and villainous roles toward the liars, but in reality, this is just yet another relationship between an adult male predator and a teenage victim. Before I end this segment, I want to mention that it's possible and even likely that I left out one or two examples of relationships with inappropriate age differences. I just want to make it clear that if so, it's not because I view any of them in a more positive light or think that they didn't deserve to be criticized. Unfortunately, as I think I've made pretty clear, there were just so many disturbing romance plots on this show that it's easy to accidentally forget about a few individual ones. And now it's time to address the elephant in the room when it comes to predatory relationships on PLL. Aria and Ezra. From the very beginning of the show, Ezria was by far one of the most popular and beloved couples. They were also one of the most heavily promoted and glorified by the show itself. They were the only couple that spanned from the pilot episode to the finale, and were even the couple that was honored with the big, flashy wedding at the show's conclusion. Although even Ian Harding, who portrayed Ezra, has had some less than savory opinions on the relationship, as have several other cast members.
I would take it out on Ezra.
Aria and Ezra were portrayed in an undeniably positive and glorified light. Before we get into the moral and ethical issues with Ezria, let's make one thing clear. This relationship, from the very first episode, was very much illegal. Yes, Aria was 16 and therefore the age of consent in Pennsylvania when they began dating. That said, Ezra's role as Aria's teacher renders the age of consent completely invalid. He held a direct position of power over her, which is a provision of PA's sexual assault statute. Another legal defense that I see often in regards to Ezra is that he and Aria did not actually have sex while he was her teacher, which supposedly prevents any illegalities. This is false on every count. PA's laws on student-teacher relationships include any degree of sexual contact, which includes kissing and making out, of which Aria and Ezra did plenty prior to him leaving Rosewood for Hollis College. And even beyond that, let's not forget about the weekends that they spent alone at Ezra's cabin after Ezra returned to teach at the high school in Season 4. There was no way that they weren't having sex during that time. Aria may have been 18 by that point, but like I mentioned earlier, his position as her teacher still makes their relationship against the law. Now that we've squared away the illegality of PLO's most featured couple, let's get into why, exactly, it was so inappropriate. As a much older man and her teacher, Ezra held a huge amount of authority and influence over Aria. This influence makes the possibility of abuse so much greater. Ezra was the one in control of Aria's grades and academic standing. This introduces a variable that is simply not present in relationships that stand on more equal footing. A student-teacher relationship's impact on other students can't be ignored either. Teachers are responsible for maintaining fairness and equity within their classroom, and removing their personal feelings towards students from how they treat them and the work that they turn in. When a teacher is involved in such a personal and intimate relationship with one student, that student's opinions on and interactions with every other student in the class is almost undoubtedly going to impact the teacher's perspectives. We even blatantly see this to be true in one of PLL's earliest episodes. Take a look at this scene, and tell me it wasn't an abuse of power on Ezra's part.
I'm sorry, Mr. Sperling. Do you have something to add to the discussion, aside from phlegm? The whole book is about what shapes us into adults? Or haven't you been paying attention?
No, I'm just saying that she...
You're just saying that Arya made an attempt to understand this book, and you haven't.
Okay, so student-teacher relationships in general might be wrong, but we saw Arya and Ezra's dynamic, and he never abused her, you might be thinking. But there's a term that sums up a lot of the subtly manipulative moments from Ezra: grooming. For those who are unaware, grooming refers to an abuser's tactic of building a relationship of trust and strong connection with their victim in order to isolate, exploit, and/or abuse them. Throughout the show, and particularly in the first season, we see many instances of Ezra commenting on Arya's maturity and how different she is from her classmates.
I don't see you as a child. You told me you were mature enough to handle this.
On one occasion, he even uses the seemingly innocent suggestion of her attending Hannah's party in order to subtly remind her how set apart she is from her peers.
Maybe you should go to the party.
Why would I want to do that?
So your classmates don't suspect you've lost interest in your peers?
All of this gives Arya an inflated sense of maturity and independence, placing her in an adult-like position that, as a 16-year-old girl, she never should have been in. In fact, there's an unnervingly adult dynamic between Arya and Ezra that really sets them apart from relationships like Spencer and Toby or Hannah and Caleb. Rewatching the show as an adult, there's a sadness to watching Arya spend hours and hours hiding away in Ezra's apartment, missing out on so many normal, age-appropriate experiences, all because she's been groomed into believing that her high school English teacher is her soulmate. And as if the age difference and power imbalance wasn't enough, PLL had to go and destroy the one minor saving grace that Ezria had going for it, that fate brought them together that day at the bar, and that her role as his student just couldn't interfere with their incredible connection. Nope. We learn in Season 4 that Ezra knew exactly who Arya was when they spoke for the first time, and that he only initially pursued a relationship with her so that he could get close to her and gain information for the book he was writing about Allison. He might not have known that she would end up being in his specific class, but he knew that she was a minor and a student at the school where he would be teaching. This means that their entire relationship was built upon deceit and prediction from the very start, and removes any benefit of the doubt that Ezra might have once been given. It also escalated his grooming and isolating tendencies to an entirely new level.
You have to start thinking me as the person that you are closest to.
But what makes relationships like Ezra and Arya's so dangerous on a show like PLL is the influence that they have on a young audience. Most adult viewers understand that just because a relationship is portrayed positively in fiction doesn't mean it should be romanticized in real life. Unfortunately, many of the younger adolescents and kids who watched PLL don't have the same knowledge and life experiences to come to the same realization. Liking Arya and Ezra because of their chemistry or storylines is one thing, but applying their relationship to real-life scenarios and using it to defend student-teacher relations in reality is completely another. I've seen so many comments from kids over the years who express the desire for an Ezra of their own, or even asked for advice on how to get together with one of their own teachers. These sorts of remarks prove point-blank why this relationship never should have been glorified on a show geared toward a teenage audience. There's a separation between fiction and reality that just doesn't typically exist until viewers reach a certain age. Finally, I'll end by discussing the narrative surrounding Ezria on the show itself. In the first few seasons, there was an air of secrecy that surrounded Ezra and Arya's relationship, a blatant recognition that if their love were to get out, there would be major consequences. But even as Arya and Ezra are hiding in his apartment and doing everything they can to prevent anyone from finding out about their relationship, the show undeniably portrays their love as an innocent, beautiful thing, akin more to a sexy, forbidden romance situation, rather than something toxic and illegal. What adds to this is that any characters who disapprove of their relationship are either dismissed or outright vilified. Byron is portrayed as an overprotective jerk after Arya's relationship comes to light, and characters like Jackie, who threatened to turn Ezra into the police for his romance with a student, are turned into total antagonists. Rewatching Jackie's storyline in particular, I was struck by how much I agreed with her perspective. Even the liars, who may have been a little shocked or disturbed by Ezria at first, came around so quickly to the idea of Arya dating their teacher that they may as well have never disapproved in the first place.
I tell you, part of me thinks this is really self-destructive behavior. Most of me just thinks it's really hot.
This narrative could not make it more obvious that supporting Arya and Ezra's relationship is supposed to be the right thing to do, and it sends a terrible message to younger fans that this type of dynamic is appealing, and that anyone who doesn't approve simply doesn't understand. So far in this video, I've discussed pressures in regards to grown adults romantically or sexually pursuing teenagers. But now I'm going to shift gears and get into various other different examples of predatory behavior, and in particular, the way that sexual assault and harassment were handled on the show. First, let's talk about Jenna and Toby. When we first discovered that Jenna was forcing herself on Toby, I gave the writers props for flipping the storyline in the books and promoting the unfortunately still controversial fact that men can be victims of female predators. Where the writers failed, however, was in the lack of any sort of resolution or justice for Toby. He and Jenna continue to have a toxic, on-and-off sibling relationship throughout the show, even after Jenna attempts to kiss him once again in the time jump. While several vague references are made to the toxicity of their relationship,
we wouldn't be us if we didn't believe in second chances, but it's okay to close the door on someone if they're toxic. It's Jenna.
We never get to see Toby truly confront or cut the cord with Jenna, and she remains in his life to the bitter end. While I do appreciate that Jenna was viewed as a straight-up villain from the time the liars discovered her predatory behavior to the last season of the show, I still feel like her outright raping Toby should have been treated with much more consideration. Then there's the sexual harassment that Hannah faced at the hands of Zach, Ella's fiancé, in Season 5. Like I mentioned near the beginning of this video, Zach was at least treated like the predator that he was by the show's narrative. My issue lies with the way that Hannah's best friends responded to her coming forward about what he'd done to her. I don't think anyone has forgotten the way that Aria reacted when Hannah came to her with her story.
You're the problem, Hannah. You're always the problem.
She refused to believe her, stooped to name-calling, and insisted that if Zach had made an advance on Hannah, it was her own fault. This is the definition of victim blaming, and while Aria did at least apologize, one quick scene does little to make up for such horrible and damaging accusations. The fact that Aria and Hannah's friendship almost immediately snaps back to normal after this only serves to brush the whole incident right under the rug. And we also can't forget about Spencer and Emily's reactions to Hannah's confession. Their roles are often brushed over or outright forgotten, likely because Aria's was so extreme that it overshadowed everything else. But they weren't much better, from asking her if she'd been drunk at the time to full-on doubting whether the incident even happened.
Are you sure that you're not reading into this?
No. Once it's said, you can't take it back.
No one was a good friend to Hannah in this situation, and Emily and Spencer never so much as apologized or acknowledged their behavior, further serving to normalize the victim-blaming attitude that they took part in. One of the most egregious examples of sexual assault, and yet one of the least recognized ones in many ways, is what Allison experienced at the hands of both AD and Rollins while locked up in Welby at the start of Season 7. Not only was Allison undeniably physically and mentally abused at Rollins' hands from the time she was admitted, but AD inseminating her with Emily's eggs was absolutely sexual assault. There's some debate over whether it can technically be classified as rape. I've always fallen on the side of yes, but I understand that others may have different perspectives. Regardless of the terminology, though, impregnating someone against their will is without a doubt a massive violation of their body. And we have to acknowledge that by stealing Emily's eggs and using them without her consent, AD committed a major violation against Emily as well. I've always considered this to be one of PLL's sickest storylines, and the fact that it was only framed as the hugely damaging trauma that it was for about one episode makes it even worse. The egg reveal takes place in Season 7, Episode 14, and by the end of Episode 15, Emily and Allie have decided to raise the baby together and start a family.
We'll do it. Together.
From this point on, the pregnancy is viewed in an almost positive light, and the traumatic sexual assault that both women went through is barely addressed again, to the point that they seem wholly unconcerned even with knowing who provided the sperm and is, therefore, biologically the baby's father. The fact that this storyline was written seemingly for no reason other than to push Emily and Allison into a relationship is incredibly disturbing. And speaking of the last season, I can't forget to include the multiple times that Toby slept with Alex Drake while under the impression that she was Spencer. Although he technically consented to the act of sex, this is another form of sexual assault, rape by deception. I don't know if the PLL writers chose to ignore this violation or if they simply didn't realize the gravity of it, but Toby was absolutely victimized by Alex, and this makes his willingness to hook right back up with Spencer by the show's end incredibly unrealistic. Being tricked into sleeping with her identical twin would undoubtedly create psychological issues surrounding any future relationship with Spencer, especially when you keep in mind that Toby had already been repeatedly violated by another woman earlier in life. And the exact same ploy that Alex used on Toby was replicated with the knowledge that Mary slept with Peter while posing as Jessica, adding just another completely glossed over incident of rape. Looking back, it's really unbelievable that a show geared toward a teenage audience included so many examples of predatory behavior, sexual harassment, and flat-out assault that were all completely brushed over or even outright romanticized. Media has such a huge influence on adolescents' perspectives and outlooks, And based on comments and reactions that I've seen from many viewers online, it's undeniable that PLL had a strong impact on kids' views toward relationships with older men in particular. I want to wrap up this video by addressing the defense of PLL's writing that I see often. That the writers hold no accountability for how they address these serious topics, and that the onus falls on parents to regulate what their children are watching. This argument would hold up for me if PLL was a show geared toward adults, but as it is, the show had a TV 14 rating and aired on a network entitled ABC Family. There was no doubt that this was a show geared toward teenagers, so it's natural that parents would make the assumption that its content is appropriate for their teens to watch. After all, the average parent wouldn't worry that the content their child is watching on Disney Channel is age-appropriate, because their show's produced for and geared toward children. Along the same lines, most parents weren't going to feel the need to closely analyze a show advertised toward teenagers, on a network with the word family right in its name. There's a safe assumption that it will be appropriate for the audience that it's meant for, which places the responsibility on the writers and the network to ensure that this is the case. Like I mentioned early in this video, I apologize if I accidentally left out a storyline or example in any of the categories that I discussed. If I did, it's telling that there were so many instances of inappropriate relationships and sexual interactions on this show that some could easily be overlooked. As always, I'm interested to see your thoughts on how PLL handled this topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.